Challenging Royal Navy ship to ship was a suicidal idea when United States Navy consisted of a handful of frigates facing world's most powerful naval force, whose hundreds of warships had dominated oceans for generations. US. Captains challenged British warships in single combat, rather than avoiding engagements that conventional naval wisdom suggested Americans should decline, when facing professionally superior enemy with overwhelming numerical advantages. One-on-one duels that American captains sought violated prudent strategy, suggesting weaker naval power should avoid direct confrontation with superior enemy, instead employing commerce, raiding, and evasion tactics that would preserve limited American naval resources. A suicidal idea because British warships were manned by professional crews with years of combat experience against French and Spanish navies, their gunnery skills and tactical discipline exceeding what American Navy could match through training alone. With smaller fleets consisting of fewer than 20 warships compared to British fleet numbering over 600 vessels, numerical disparity made American naval strategy of seeking single-ship duels seem desperate rather than sound, when British could replace losses, while Americans could not. Fewer guns in total American fleet than single British squadron possessed, making every American warship precious asset that prudent strategy would preserve, rather than risking in duels against professional British Navy. America should never win single duel, according to British expectations based on Royal Navy's professional superiority and combat experience gained through decades of European warfare. British confidence in their naval supremacy making American challenges seem foolishly brave rather than tactically sound. Never win was British assumption that their professional crews, superior training, and combat experience would defeat American frigates in any fair engagement, making British captains accept American challenges confidently expecting victories that would demonstrate Royal Navy's continued dominance over upstart American Navy, whose challenge seemed more desperate than threatening to empire, controlling world's oceans. The wins that shock world occurred when American frigates defeated British warships in series of single-ship actions that violated British expectations about naval combat outcomes. USS Constitution, United States, and Wasp obliterate elite British frigates through combination of superior American ship design, excellent gunnery, and aggressive tactics that British captains had not anticipated from Navy they had dismissed as inferior. Obliterate suggested completeness of American victories where British frigates were captured or destroyed after relatively brief engagements, British defeat being decisive rather than narrow escape that might have preserved British pride despite tactical loss. Elite British frigates whose professional crews and combat experience should have guaranteed victory according to conventional naval wisdom that experience and training determined outcomes, making their defeats by American ships psychologically devastating to British naval confidence. London newspapers demand explanations for defeats that seemed impossible when British naval superiority had been assumed fact, rather than question requiring verification through combat. How is this possible became British question when American victories contradicted everything British public believed about Royal Navy's invincibility, defeats requiring explanations that went beyond admitting American ships and crews were superior in specific engagements. The reckless tactic transforms American morale by demonstrating that British military power could be defeated through aggressive action rather than through cautious defensive strategy. Victories proving that American forces could win against professional British military when employing tactics that exploited American advantages. And humiliates empire whose naval dominance had been foundation of British global power. American frigate victories damaging British prestige in ways that exceeded tactical significance of individual ship losses by demonstrating that Royal Navy was not invincible and that American Navy deserved respect rather than contempt. From British officers who had dismissed American naval challenge as insignificant threat to British maritime supremacy. A half-trained force crosses border when American militia invaded Canada in 1812, believing conquest would be rapid campaign against lightly defended British territory. America sends poorly trained militia whose military preparation consisted of minimal drill and whose officers often lacked professional military education, their combat effectiveness being questionable when facing British regulars and Canadian militia defending their territory. into Canada, where American planners believed British military presence was weak and where they assumed Canadian population would welcome American liberation from British rule, assumptions proving wildly incorrect when invasion encountered effective resistance. Believing citizens will welcome liberation was fundamental miscalculation about Canadian sentiments, American assumption that Canadians shared American revolutionary ideology, being contradicted by Canadian loyalty to British Crown and by Canadian resistance to American invasion. A delusional idea that Canadian population would support American invasion rather than defending their territory against foreign attack, American political calculations being based on wishful thinking rather than on accurate intelligence about Canadian political attitudes. A reckless one in military terms because sending poorly trained militia against British regulars and Canadian defenders violated military wisdom about matching force quality to mission difficulty. American invasion plan, assuming numerical superiority, would compensate for training deficiencies. Delusional and reckless characterized American invasion planning that overestimated American military capabilities while underestimating British-Canadian defensive strength and Canadian population's determination to resist. American conquest, combination of errors producing disasters at Detroit and Queenston Heights, where American forces were defeated decisively by smaller British-Canadian forces whose professional competence and defensive advantages overcame American numerical superiority that invasion planners had believed would guarantee success against weak opposition that actually proved formidable when fighting to defend Canadian territory from American invasion. The small victories that still terrify Britain occurred when American forces achieved tactical successes despite overall strategic failure of Canadian invasion. Isolated American victories, demonstrating that British-Canadian forces were not invincible even when defeating American invasion generally. Despite disasters at Detroit, where American General William Hull surrendered entire army, and at Queenston Heights, where American assault failed catastrophically, American forces pull off bold actions that achieved limited objectives even when broader invasion collapsed. At Detroit, where American recapture in 1813 reversed earlier humiliating surrender. At Queenston, where some American units fought effectively despite overall tactical defeat. And at Thames, where American forces defeated British Indian Alliance and killed Tecumseh, eliminating major threat to American frontier settlements. Pull-off suggesting these victories were achieved against odds when American military performance had been generally poor, making successes notable for exceeding low expectations that earlier failures had created. Even when tactics fail strategically through not achieving conquest of Canada that invasion was supposed to accomplish, American unpredictability in attempting operations that conventional military wisdom would have rejected created problems for British commanders who could not predict what Americans would attempt next. The unpredictability leaves British furious at American refusal to accept defeat gracefully and to abandon invasion after initial failures, American persistence in launching new offensives despite previous defeats, forcing British to maintain defensive preparations. And off balance, because American willingness to attempt reckless operations made British defensive planning difficult when they could not predict where or when Americans would attack next. Unpredictability being American advantage when facing professionally superior enemy, whose conventional military thinking made them vulnerable to unconventional American tactics that achieved surprise through attempting operations that British considered too risky or foolish for rational commanders to order, despite American commanders' willingness to gamble on bold actions. Building navy in wilderness was Oliver Hazard Perry's challenge when ordered to construct fleet on Lake Erie, where no naval infrastructure existed, and where everything necessary for shipbuilding would need to be created from local colonies resources. Oliver Hazard Perry constructs ships from scratch using timber cut from surrounding forests, his shipbuilding operation being improvised industrial effort in location lacking facilities that proper naval construction required. In forest, where trees became ships through labor-intensive process of felling timber, sawing planks, and assembling vessels whose construction quality was questionable when using green wood that had not been properly seasoned. Using green wood that shrank and warped as it dried creating structural problems that peacetime Navy would never have accepted, but that wartime necessity made acceptable when alternatives were having no fleet at all. Improvised crews, consisting of frontier volunteers, regular sailors, and soldiers pressed into naval service despite lacking maritime experience, their naval skills being minimal when compared to British crews, whose professional training exceeded anything Americans could provide in Wilderness Shipyard. A ridiculous plan according to conventional naval standards that required years of preparation and professional resources for building warships, Perry's timeline and resources being inadequate for constructing fleet that could challenge British naval control of Lake Erie. That should collapse instantly when ships constructed from green wood with improvised crews attempted combat against professional British squadron whose experience and training should have compensated for any American advantages in ship, numbers, or firepower. British confidence in their superiority, making Perry's challenge seem desperate gamble that would end in American defeat, confirming British naval dominance despite American construction of fleet, whose existence demonstrated American determination to contest British control of Great Lakes, regardless of material disadvantages that conventional wisdom suggested made American challenge futile. "We have met" enemy became Perry's famous dispatch after defeating British squadron on Lake Erie in September 1813, his laconic message understating significance of victory that reversed strategic situation in Northwest, and humiliated them through complete defeat of British squadron whose capture gave Americans control of Lake Erie and forced British evacuation of Detroit and retreat from Michigan Territory. Perry annihilates British squadron through aggressive tactics that brought American ships into close-range combat where superior American firepower could be employed effectively against British vessels whose long-range gunnery advantages were neutralized by Perry's willingness to accept damage during approach, in exchange for decisive engagement. British squadron, whose professional crews and combat experience should have defeated American fleet constructed from green wood and manned by improvised crews, making British defeat psychologically devastating beyond tactical significance of losing control of single Great Lake. Flips control of entire Northwest by making British position in Michigan Territory untenable, when American control of Lake Erie cut British supply lines, forcing British retreat that allowed American reoccupation of territory lost earlier in war. Of entire region whose strategic balance shifted from British dominance to American control through single naval engagement, demonstrating naval power's importance in theater where water transportation was essential for military operations. A reckless gamble-building fleet in wilderness using inadequate resources becomes one of most iconic naval upsets when Perry's improvised squadron defeats professional British force, victory validating American willingness to attempt operations that conventional wisdom suggested were impossible. Of all time in American naval history, because Perry's victory was achieved against greater odds than most naval engagements when considering his resource limitations and time constraints that should have prevented construction of construction. Fleet capable of challenging British naval supremacy on Great Lakes. An army of shopkeepers faces British elite when Baltimore prepared defences against British forces that had burned Washington weeks earlier in August 1814. Merchants, cabinet makers, and free black volunteers man ramparts at Fort McHenry and at defensive positions around Baltimore, their civilian occupations, suggesting they lacked military training necessary for defending against professional British assault. Man ramparts in defensive positions that would face British bombardment and potential British assault, civilian defenders' determination compensating for their lack of professional military training when defending their city. At Fort McHenry, whose star-shaped fortification commanded approach to Baltimore Harbor, fort's defensive position being critical for preventing British naval forces from reaching city's waterfront where British could land troops for assault on Baltimore itself. Baltimore prepares to face same army that had easily defeated American forces defending Washington, British success in capital, suggesting they would overwhelm Baltimore's improvised defenses through superior professional military capabilities. Same army whose burning of Washington demonstrated British willingness to destroy American cities, and whose combat effectiveness had been proven through defeating American regulars protecting capital, making British threat to Baltimore credible and terrifying. Days earlier, when British forces had marched into Washington and burned public buildings, including Capitol and President's House, recent British success, making Baltimore defenders aware that they faced professional military force whose capabilities exceeded their own. British elite troops whose combat experience included European wars against Napoleon's forces, their professional military skills making them formidable opponents for civilian volunteers whose military training was minimal compared to British regulars, whose assault on Baltimore seemed likely to succeed as easily as their Washington operation had overwhelmed American defenses protecting Capitol. The Night Empire was forced to retreat occurred after British bombardment of Fort McHenry failed to destroy American defenses or to force Baltimore's surrender. British rockets, mortars, and warships failed to break amateur defense, whose determination exceeded what British commanders had anticipated when planning assault on Baltimore, defensive resistance being more effective than British expected from civilian volunteers. To break defenders whose morale remained high despite intensive British bombardment lasting through night of September 13th to 14th, 1814, forts continued resistance, demonstrating that American civilian defenders possessed fighting spirit that British professional assessment had underestimated. Amateur defense in sense that Fort McHenry's garrison consisted largely of militia and volunteers rather than regular soldiers, their civilian backgrounds making their successful defense more impressive when facing British military professionals. The reckless tactic of defending Baltimore with civilian volunteers inspires Star-Spangled Banner when Francis Scott Key witnessed Fort's flag still flying after night of British bombardment, his poem capturing American determination that British attack had failed to break. Inspires National Anthem through demonstrating that American civilians would defend their cities effectively against British professional military forces, whose superiority in training and experience did not guarantee victory when facing determined defenders. And humiliates British commanders whose failure to capture Baltimore forced them to abandon assault and to withdraw fleet from Chesapeake Bay without achieving objectives that burning Washington had suggested were attainable through British military superiority. Baltimore's successful defense contradicting British assumptions about their ability to capture American cities through overwhelming professional military capabilities that Fort McHenry's resistance had proven insufficient for, breaking American civilian defenders' determination to protect their city from British assault that conventional wisdom suggested should have succeeded. Pirates, frontiersmen, Creoles, and slaves on one line was Andrew Jackson's defensive force at New Orleans in January 1815 when he assembled coalition of groups that normally did not cooperate militarily. Jackson assembles most chaotic fighting force in American history through necessity, when regular military forces were insufficient for defending New Orleans against British invasion. His willingness to accept any fighters regardless of social status, creating unique military organization. Smugglers, including Jean Lafitte's Baratarian pirates, whose knowledge of local terrain and whose artillery skills made them valuable despite their criminal backgrounds. Hunters and frontiersmen, whose marksmanship exceeded regular soldiers' abilities. Sharpshooters, whose rifle accuracy would prove devastating against British formations. Free men of color whose military service Jackson accepted, despite social prejudices that normally excluded them from military service, their combat effectiveness being proven during battle despite doubts about their reliability. The British mock it as circus when observing Jackson's diverse force, whose composition violated British military norms about proper army organization, their contempt for American forces' irregular composition, making them underestimate its combat effectiveness. As circus, suggesting that British viewed Jackson's army as disorganized rabble rather than as effective military force, their professional disdain for irregular troops, making them confident that British regulars would easily defeat American defenders. Most chaotic in composition but unified by determination to defend New Orleans from British invasion, Jackson's force combining diverse groups through shared objective, despite social differences that would have prevented their cooperation under normal circumstances, their unity in battle proving more important than professional military training that British possessed, but that did not guarantee victory when facing defenders who knew terrain and who fought with desperation, that British professional soldiers could not match. The victory that broke British Army's pride occurred on January 8, 1815, when Jackson's defensive line repulsed British assault with devastating effectiveness. Jackson's forces annihilate veteran redcoats of Pakenham's army through combination of defensive positions advantages, devastating American rifle and artillery fire, and British tactical errors that exposed attacking troops to sustained American defensive fire. Veteran redcoats who had fought in European wars against Napoleon's armies, their combat experience being extensive but proving inadequate against American defensive tactics that exploited terrain advantages and superior marksmanship. Of Pakenham's army, whose commanding general was killed during assault, along with over 2,000 British casualties, compared to minimal American losses, casualty ratio being so lopsided that it represented one of most one-sided battles in military history. Most lopsided battle of war, when comparing casualties where British suffered over 2,000 killed, wounded, or captured, while American casualties were under 100, disproportion demonstrating effectiveness of American defensive tactics against British frontal assault, of entire conflict, because no other War of 1812 engagement produced casualty ratios approaching New Orleans, where British assault was repulsed so completely that attacking force was shattered. The reckless tactic of assembling diverse force from pirates, frontiersmen, and freed slaves becomes most humiliating defeat in British military memory, because professional British army was destroyed by irregular American force whose composition British had mocked as circus, making defeat more psychologically damaging than losing to professional American regulars would have been. In British memory, where New Orleans joined other humiliating defeats that damaged British military prestige, battle's outcome, demonstrating that American forces could achieve decisive victory against British professionals when tactics and terrain favoured defenders, whose determination and marksmanship overcame British advantages in training and military discipline. Reckless or revolutionary becomes question when evaluating American tactics during War of 1812, whose unconventional approaches achieved results that conventional military wisdom suggested were impossible. America didn't win through discipline, matching British professional military standards, or through tradition of military excellence that British Army possessed through centuries of European warfare, instead achieving success through improvisation and unconventional tactics. Or tradition, but through refusing to accept British definitions of proper military conduct, American willingness to attempt operations that British considered reckless, creating opportunities that conventional tactics would not have produced. It won by refusing to play Britain's game, where British professional advantages in training and experience would have guaranteed their victory, instead employing tactics that exploited American advantages in marksmanship, motivation, and local knowledge. And instead doing what no empire could predict, because American tactics were improvised responses to specific situations rather than being applications of established military doctrine that British could anticipate and counter. No empire could predict American willingness to challenge British frigates in single combat, to build navy in wilderness, to defend cities with civilian volunteers, or to assemble armies from pirates and frontiersmen whose irregular composition violated professional military standards. The War of 1812 wasn't polished performance demonstrating American mastery of European military arts, but was rough, effective improvisation that achieved strategic objectives through unconventional means. It was reckless masterpiece, combining desperate gambles with inspired improvisation, American victories resulting from willingness to attempt operations that conventional wisdom rejected as too risky. That rewrote global respect for United States by demonstrating that American forces could defeat British professionals through employing tactics that British military tradition had not prepared them to counter. War's outcome elevating American international status from former colony to respected nation, whose military capabilities commanded British respect, despite lacking professional military establishment that European powers possessed. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.